Hello and welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about how constructors can have arguments just like any other function. We're going to add the window dimensions to the constructor for the character. Let's get started. Now, we've seen that in the character class, we created a function called setScreenPause, and this function takes the window width and the window height as integers, because this vector is the screen position that we need to draw the character to the screen. And if we want the character in the center of the screen, we need those window dimensions. And we've seen that whenever we create an instance of the character class, we need to call setScreenPause, passing in that window width and the window height. Rather than having an extra function to call, we can tie this requirement in to the construction of the character class. We can do that by changing the constructor so that it has input requirements. So by adding two input parameters to the character constructor, we can then set the value of the screenPause vector in the constructor. And this way, if you attempt to construct an instance of the character class without passing in those required input parameters, you'll get an error. So you can't construct an instance of the character class without the window width and the window height. Now that the character class has required input parameters for the character constructor, we must now pass those in when we create an instance of the character class. And we can do so with braced initialization, just like we do with structs. So now, instead of creating an instance of the character class and then calling setScreenPause to set its screen position, we have instead required input parameters that we must pass in when we construct a character instance, otherwise we'll get an error. So as a challenge, I want you to take the character constructor and add two input parameters of type int called winWidth and winHeight. I want you to set the value of screenPause in the constructor. And now that we're doing this in the constructor, we can delete the function setScreenPause. Delete it from the character.h file and the character.cpp file. And since setScreenPause will no longer be a method on the character class, delete the function call from main.cpp as well. And now that the character constructor has required input parameters, you're going to need to pass window width and window height into the character constructor. Pause the video and give this a try. So we're here in character.h, and here's our constructor. Now we're going to add two input parameters of type int. So the first we'll call winWidth, and the second we'll call winHeight. Now we've changed the input parameter list here in the header file, but we also need to change it here in the source file. So we're going to add those input parameters to the constructor here. Now we can set the value of screenPause. So from here in the setScreenPause function, let's go ahead and copy these lines of code and paste them into the constructor. And now we can simply delete the setScreenPause function. So let's delete it from here in the source file and go back to character.h and delete it from here in the header file. Now let's go back to character.cpp and take a look at the code we added to the constructor. Just to remind ourselves what we're doing here, we're taking the window width and dividing by 2, and we're taking the window height and dividing by 2. This gives us the center of the screen. But of course we have to move to the left and up by half of the width and half of the height of our sprite. That's why we take half of the width and half of the height. And then of course we're scaling that half by 4 because we're drawing the texture scaled by 4. So having a magic number 4 here is never a good idea, so let's go ahead and add a variable called scale. And that way, instead of just using a hard-coded 4 in our code, we'll have scale instead. So here in character.h, let's add a private variable. We'll go all the way down to the bottom and make a float called scale. And we'll initialize it here to 4.0f. Now we can take our scale variable and use this instead of 4.0f in the source file. So we're going to replace 4.0f here with scale and also here with scale. Now this isn't the only place we used 4.0f. If we scroll down, we'll see down here in the tick function, our dest rectangle is also using 4.0f to scale the texture. So we're going to replace 4.0f here with scale and here with scale as well. And now we're not using 4.0f anywhere. Let's scroll back up to the constructor. And the last thing I want to talk about is our use of the C-style cast with win width. Now, I showed you C-style casting because it's a technique that came with the C programming language. But as C++ came around, better functions were created for casting values. You see, the C-style cast can be dangerous, as it doesn't check the types it's casting to or from. But C++ has a built-in function called static cast, which checks the types at compile time and will prevent you from casting incompatible types. The static cast function looks like this: static underscore cast with angle brackets and then parentheses. And the value that we wish to cast goes in the parentheses. And in the angle brackets goes the type we wish to cast to. So if we wish to cast the win width integer to a float, then we pass float into the angle brackets. We're going to use static cast on win height as well. So we'll put win height in the parentheses and we'll have float in the angle brackets. Now we have the same behavior. Our integer is cast to a float, only we have the benefit of using static cast, which comes with type checking. So from now on, we'll use static cast instead of a C-style cast to gain this added safety. Now we must delete the setScreenPause function call from here in main.cpp. So let's highlight this line and delete it as well. So here in main.cpp, we need to pass in those required input parameters. So we're going to use braced initialization and pass in window width and window height. Now our knight has its screen pause variable set, and if we hit run and start debugging, then we have our game and the character is drawn to the center of the screen as expected. So in summary, we learned that a constructor can take arguments. We added 2 arguments to the character constructor and then set the value for the screen pause variable in the constructor. We also added a scale variable, so we're no longer hard coding 4.0f everywhere, and we learned that C++ has a safer way than the C language for casting, and that's by the use of the static cast function. Great job! I'll see you in the next video.